Russia-Ukraine war has crossed the 100-day mark. It's now into its fourth month of brutal, unforgiving combat. Brutal combat. It started off as a maneuver war, but it has now stalemated into a war of pure attrition, bloody attrition, which is unprecedented in scale and scope. It is extremely vital for us in India to learn the right lessons from this war, because every war turns out to be a combat laboratory where weapons, equipment, doctrines, organizations are put to the acid test of war. And we have to see what worked and what did not work. This particular conflict is of special relevance to India because of the simple fact that about 70 to 80% of India's cutting edge equipment is of Russian origin. Our T-72, T-90 tanks, almost 95% of our tank fleet is of Russian origin, and these tanks were put to the brutal acid test of combat in Ukraine. Our Air Force, our Su-30s, our MiG-29s, etc., they are all of Russian origin. Our Navy is of Russian origin, a large part of it still. The Kashin class destroyer, the Petya and Greva class frigates, the Kilo class submarines, the nuclear submarine, etc. All this equipment is of Russian origin. Our AWACS are of Russian origin, the Illusion based AWACS. So we have to see how did they perform in combat. What do we need to change? What do we need to discard? What do we need to retrofit? What do we need to adapt? Because, unless we learn the right lessons, we're going to repeat the same mistakes that were possibly committed in this conflict and in earlier conflicts. So the simple fact of the matter is that, we have to now separate the truth from the post-truth. Because ever since this war started, we have seen an unprecedented barrage of information warfare, cyber warfare, coming from the United States, coming from NATO, which is trying to, twist reality, which is trying to spin doctor the truth and try and give us an impression of an overwhelming Ukrainian victory. The problem is that because of this barrage of information warfare on the social media, electronic print media, a lot of, civilian analysts and the others have drawn patently wrong lessons from this war. There is a tendency to have, Insta analysis or, very quickie kind of lessons learnt from this war, which are extremely superficial. For example, there is that talk on the media channels, is the tank dead? Is the Javelin, the Stinger missiles, the answer to tanks and jet fighters? And is the UAV now the king of the battlefield? I think if you go by these Insta analysis, you could go badly wrong. The tank is not dead. And if you do a very statistical, operational research, statistical analysis of the tank kills that have happened, and the Austrian army has done, their research and development wing has done a very systematic analysis of the, the fighting in the Donbass region for the last 7 years. And they have built up a statistical database which shows you that 45% of the tank kills have been inflicted by the artillery, especially the medium 155 millimeter and heavier artillery and the multi-barrel rocket launchers. The fact of the matter is that the number of kills which have been inflicted by ATGMs is thus 13%. Yet if you see the media hype, the social media hype, you will get the feeling that the Javelin is the anti-tank guided missile, the British anti-tank guided missile, the German Panzerfaust. These ATGMs have, destroyed tanks across the board. Well, they have inflicted casualties, but in the overall percentage, that is just 13%. What did the Ukrainian generals ask the Americans for? Not more javelins, not more stingers really. They wanted medium and heavy artillery. And now they are asking for their multi-barrel rocket launchers, which actually really destroy tanks and the enemy artillery. You know, so Instagrams or Instagram kind of a analysis doesn't really work. So what then really are the lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war? I'd list them in the order that of relevance to India. We are looking at these lessons from a purely Indo-centric, primarily Indo-centric point of view, and quite obviously some of the lessons that apply to the Indian armed forces also apply to armed forces across the globe. But we are primarily interested in what is in it for us. The first lesson that I would like to highlight is about military demographics. Russia has a declining population. The average age is well over 40 years. The average age in India is 27 years by contrast, 26 to 27 years. We are a very youthful population, but Russia is an aging population. And as such, they have not been able to deploy, the amount of manpower that is needed to fight the war. 150,000 Russian soldiers have attacked a Ukrainian army, which by conscription, by getting in territorial units, activating territorial units, is 250,000 strong. That means the defender is about 100,000 more than the attackers. And yet, if the Russians have been able to persist and push and bash through, it is because of their very heavy traditional reliance on manpower, on firepower as opposed to manpower. They have been using firepower to economize on manpower. But the simple fact is that the traditional Russian way of war relied upon mass. Mass in manpower, mass in firepower, suppressive firepower. And they had what is called a first echelon that attacked first. When it was used up, decimated to 70%, the second echelon, the third echelon came in. What we noted in this war was a very surprising change. The Russians, initially at least, were not fighting as per the classical Russian way of war. They were not using the signature Russian heavy reliance on tube artillery, multi-barrel rocket launchers to pulverize, to devastate the opposition before they went in. Murderous artillery barrages, fire assaults. That was missing because the orders from Moscow, the orders from Putin were that they must not inflict collateral damage onto the civilian populations, because the Russians actually expected to be welcomed as liberators, as the Indian army that had gone into Bangladesh was welcomed as liberators. But they got a shock that from 2014 till now, the Americans, the Europeans have worked so hard to crystallize the Ukrainian identity, fill them with poison, have a Nazi kind of a revival in Ukraine, a nationalist revival which has made the Russians and the Ukrainians, who were close cousins, into implacable enemies like India and Pakistan. So, it was a mistake for the Russians to have these cultural factors cloud their thinking at the outset of the war. And as a result of this thinking from Moscow, there was a fierce restraint put on the use of firepower, which is the traditional Russian war winning factor. That is why most analysts were saying this war is a no-brainer. It will be over in 4 to 5 days, 7 days, maximum 10 to 1 week to 2 weeks, this war should have been over, as per all military analysts. But we hadn't catered for the uncharacteristic restraint showed by the Russians in the initial phase of the war, especially in the Kyiv and the Kharkiv sectors. They did not use the suppressive firepower to the degree and extent which they use. That was seen in southern Ukraine, in the area of Crimea and northwards, where the 58 Combined Arms Army attacked under General Alexander Dvornikov, and he is their hero of the Syrian war, hardened combat experienced generals who actually really ignored the orders for restraint. And he used the traditional Russian method of brutal artillery bombardments, and we have seen that he achieved success in Kherson, was the first town to fall. Then was Mariupol, which has fallen in the month of May. And, they went up to Zaporizhzhia. So they achieved their success because they followed the traditional Russian method of war fighting. But I'm sorry, in the other sectors, especially Kherson, especially in Kharkiv and in Kyiv, the Russians failed to adopt their standard techniques of fighting. They still went on by hybrid war methods they had used in the Donbass, and they have suffered, they have underperformed. But the Russians appear to be quick learners. They learned quickly on the job, and they have quickly reoriented, remodified their plans, tailored them down, pared them down. It was never their intention to conquer the whole of Ukraine. They just did not have the troops. And even the attacks that they launched on 1,000 kilometers of frontage from Kyiv in the north to Mariupol in the south, their manpower deployed was far too insufficient. They had to capture 10 to 15 cities and major towns. And each town, if you really go by the example of Stalingrad and Leningrad in World War II, can take lakhs of troops. So for a real conquest, 5 to 8 lakhs of troops were actually required if you really wanted to conquer the whole of Ukraine. Quite obviously, the Russians didn't have that manpower, and their objectives were confined to eastern Ukraine. They did go for Kyiv initially, and their impression was that, like generals fight the last war, that like it had happened in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014, in Donbass and in Crimea, it would be over in 3 to 4 days. That is the mistake most generals make. They prepare to fight the last war. But a lot of changes had occurred on the ground between 2014 and 2022, which they failed to crank in, and they paid a price for initial underperformance. But like I said, the Russians quickly, they have proved to be a learning organization, and they adjusted, they have changed, they have recalibrated, reoriented their plans and their military deployment. Right now they are focusing in phase 2 of the war only on Donbass region, which they are determined to conquer. They have more or less taken the town of Sverdlovsk completely, more or less gone, and now they are coming to Lysychansk, and they'll go south to Kramatorsk, which is the headquarter of the Ukrainians in the Donbass region. They are determined to take the Donbass Russian-speaking area. They have already, captured the whole southern coast of the Ukraine. So now let us go down to the lessons learned. Lessons learned in the Indian context. The first is the military demographics. Russia is terribly short of manpower, and the ill effects of this lack of manpower are clearly evident in the campaign and in the time that it has taken. Very few countries can afford a prolonged war. And if you don't want a prolonged war, then I'm sorry, you have to use manpower. There is no getting away from the fact. God is always on the side of the big battalions is an old truism. Now in India, ever since 1990, when our economy took a big hit and we were almost economically collapsing, there has been a debate, manpower versus machines. And the thinking in India was that manpower in India is also becoming very costly, especially after one rank, one pension. The pension bill of the Indian Armed Forces itself has gone over to 1 lakh crore rupees. And the pays also have to be increased because economic aspirations have increased. So, there is a tendency in the Indian Armed Forces, in the Indian Army especially, to say that, oh, manpower is a big waste of money, and therefore we must cut manpower, economize on manpower, and try and buy more of military technology, military weapons and equipment. because our revenue budget is going so high that very little is left for the capital budget. And we can't buy the weapons and equipment we need. So therefore, the only answer is to cut manpower. I'm sorry, that is wrong. You are going grievously wrong. The answer is to increase your defense budget. Germany is increasing its defense budget by almost 100%. Japan is increasing its defense budget to face the greater challenges and threats that are emerging from the environment. But in India, the answer is to reduce the defense budget as a percentage of the GDP. It used to be 2.8%, it is today down to 2.1%. Why? Because the threats have increased. Therefore, we must reduce defense budget. And the only answer that you got is cut the manpower. And in India, do you know that we, in the last 2 years, because of COVID, did not recruit any manpower, and our manpower has dipped by 2 lakhs. Your infantry battalions today are short of well over a company each. And you know the kind of pressure that can put the fighting units under? You can't afford to do that. And there are crazy ideas of how we must reduce manpower. Let me give you a bit of historical context. In late 1990s, just before the Kargil war, General Malik was our army chief, and because we were not getting the defense budgets that we needed, he proposed that we will suppress manpower to increase equipment, capital budget. The simple fact is that the army then started on a manpower cutting exercise. Pioneer companies were disbanded, Mule GS companies were disbanded, along with a lot of other minor ancillary units, in the hope that when we reduce manpower flab, it is a waste, it is useless, we will then get better weapons. What the Russian war has shown you is Russia short of weapons? Is Russia short of equipment? What is the problem they are facing? The problem they are facing is shortage of manpower. They put in 150,000 troops to start the war. They are fighting 2.5 lakh Ukrainians, and they have refused to mobilize. They are recycling and reusing the same troops that got a bloody nose in Ukraine and in Kyiv and Kharkiv. They are now fighting in Donbass with hardly a week of rest, recoupment. You see, that can cause you severe damage and setbacks in the real battlefield. So Russia has a genuine problem of shortage of manpower. Do we have a problem of shortage of manpower? We are the youngest country in the world, and at 1.4 billion population, India can raise the biggest army in the world. It will provide jobs to your out-of-job youth. They don't have jobs. And our answer is to cut manpower by 2 lakhs. Out of 13 lakhs, 2 lakhs you have reduced. Why have your threats gone down? Your threats have increased. China is getting aggressive, Pakistan is getting aggressive, and you reduce your manpower. What is the kind of war that you are fighting? You are fighting mostly in the mountains. Mountains eat up manpower. You don't know where your men have gone really, and for every single casualty that has to be brought down, you have to use 18 boys to get down 1 man in the mountains. So, if you cut manpower, who will evacuate your wounded, your dead? Who will send up weapons, ammunition, water, rations, equipment, etc.? Let me give you a historical example of what happened in the Kargil war. Before the Kargil war, I was in MO5, Director MO5. Manpower was part of my charter, and I was told that we have to reduce manpower. I had just come back from Kargil, and I had seen how to get 1 casualty down, you need 18 men for 1 man. So either you will fight or you will evacuate your dead and wounded. And therefore I protested very vehemently that this would cause us problem in the field. But I was overruled at that time and said, go ahead and disband the manpower. Fortunately for us, the Kargil war started. The chief himself went forward many times, not once but many times during the war, and he saw The wounded lying, groaning in pain, crying. He said, why aren't they being evacuated? They said, sir, there are no pioneer company. Either the boys who are fighting, they fight or they evacuate. So we can't do both. He was furious, but it's a great example of self-correction that he came back and immediately orders were given to stop the disbandment of the pioneer companies, stop the disbandment of the Mule GS and Mule MA companies, just to mention three. You know, this simple fact is that at the end of the Kargil war, we had a situation in which the field piece profile of the infantry was ruined. It was in tatters. You know, units that had served 3 years tenure in Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram, they came to peace stations in Kalimpong, in Yol, and they had to be sent off straight to J&K for the counter-terrorist operation. So, officers, men, they spent 6 years non-stop fighting CT-CI operations. When they went home, their children called them uncle because they hadn't seen them for 6 years. So, there was a lot of stress on the fighting units, especially the infantry. And at the conclusion of the Kargil war, instead of reducing manpower, we had to add 36 RR units, 6 sector headquarters, 4 force headquarters of the Rashtriya Rifles to take the load off the infantry. So to all those who are so keen, who think they have hit a brilliant answer, cut this faltu manpower, they are just wasting our money. I'm sorry, they are not. They are fighting and dying for you. You see? And your country needs to create jobs. You can't afford a situation where you are taking away 2 lakh soldiers, serving soldiers, and telling your army to fight. The threats are increasing, so fight with less. Less money, less manpower. It is a recipe for disaster. Look, wars are expensive. I'm sorry, if your threats are rising, you can't afford to cut your defense budget, even in percentile terms. You can't afford to cut your manpower. You still need to buy more weapons. And for that, the logical answer, the answer the world over that is followed is increase your defense budget to cater for the threat realistically. But, to have a set of accountants and babus let loose, manpower is the problem. It is not the problem, it is the solution. Cut manpower, slash manpower. फालतू पैसा ले रहे हैं सरकार का, फालतू नहीं ले रहे. They are doing a job which has to be done, and it's a very difficult job. Don't add to their difficulties by reducing manpower. That's number one. The second lesson to emerge from this war is the importance, overwhelming importance of medium artillery. Medium artillery is 155 millimeters, 130 millimeter calibers and above. That is medium artillery. Heavy is 203 millimeter caliber. So, what we have found in Ukraine is that the Ukrainian generals are crying today, not for javelins and for stingers, the tamasha and the hype, not for Barkateyar drones. They, sir, are crying for medium guns. That is the war winning factor. Like I told you, the Ukrainian army analysis tells you that the artillery has inflicted 45% kills on tanks, 65 kills on the enemy artillery systems, and about 57% of the enemy vehicles have been destroyed by artillery. Therefore, the javelins have only destroyed the anti-tank guided missiles, which so much is being made of, have only destroyed 13%. In actual terms, please go by facts. Don't go by hype and propaganda blitz and sales pitch. So, the fact is that the medium artillery has proved to be a war-winning factor. The Ukrainians are saying, give us artillery and we could still prevail over the Russians. The Russians have brought a preponderance of artillery. They have bashed the daylights out of the Ukrainians in the Donbass region. And now they are slowly turning the tide. Once again, this lesson is very pertinent to the Indian context. After the Kargil war, when the Kargil, even before the Kargil war, in the 1965 war, the Americans had gifted artillery to the Pakistanis on a liberal scale. They had a brigade of 155mm guns, which they used to devastating effect in the Cham operations, and then later they caused us a lot of problems in the Sialkot sector. A brigade of 155mm guns. And the lesson that we learnt was, then we tried to buy, since American equipment was not available to us, we bought the Russian 130mm guns, we bought the Russian multi-barrel Grad rocket launchers, which proved to be a very great factor in winning the 71 war. Heavy, medium artillery, multi-barrel Grad rocket launchers, devastating artillery barrages, right? So at the end of the Kargil war, when we fought the Kargil war, we had to then pull in our Bofors guns from all our strike corps, make them out, send them to the border in Kargil, and they proved to be a war-winning factor, the 155mm Bofors guns. We had initially planned to buy 450 and produce about 1100 in India. Once we had purchased the 450, the bomb burst, and the Bofors scandal burst upon the Indian army, and those 1100 guns that we were supposed to produce in India, that never happened. And for decades our military acquisition programs were delayed by the ghost of Bofors. The Bofors gun is an excellent gun. It proved to be war-winning factor in Kargil. So at the end of the war, once again in the MO Directorate, we decided to plan on the mediumization of the Indian artillery. The Indian artillery had many different calibers. They had 75/24 howitzers, then we had 105mm field guns, 3.7-inch howitzers also were there at that time. Then we had 122mm Russian guns, 130mm Russian guns, and then we got the Bofors 155, just 450 of them. So there was a plethora of calibers. Each one had different ammunition. Ammunition management was becoming a big bloody problem. So we decided we will standardize the Indian artillery around the 155mm caliber gun. And all the guns would be replaced by Bofors equivalents 155mm guns. But because of the ghost of Bofors, we still have not been able to do it. How many years have passed since the Kargil war? You still have not been able to mediumize your artillery. It was only in the last few years when this government came that we got firstly the M777 medium artillery guns from the Americans. They're just about lightweight titanium guns which can be taken to the mountain, just about 150 odd. And then we got 100 of the Vajras, self-propelled 155mm artillery of Korean origin, which we built in India under license. Now we are trying to go in for 200 more of these. And then we got the Dhanush, and then we are now going to get the ATAGs. What we need, the ATAG gun has proved to be a master gun. The ATAG gun has a range of 48 kilometers compared to the American equivalent gun, which has a range of 45 kilometers. It has a burst fire capability of 5 rounds a minute to the American 3 rounds a minute. You see, so the simple fact is we have created a master gun, a master design. But amazingly, we had problems inducting this gun. There were lots of, no, we want Israeli gun, no, we want this gun, that gun, etc. And that has delayed the induction. Thank God it is now, those teething troubles are over. And we hope that, like hell, that these guns, at least 1800 of them, will be inducted the fastest. If we get them in the fastest, this could prove to be a war-winning factor in any war with China or Pakistan. We need the medium guns and we need them fast, immediately. Now let's take up some of the other technical questions. Is the tank dead? No, absolutely not. It is the only offensive instrument still available to armed forces. It has only shown its relevance in fighting in built up areas, in fighting in urban terrain. It is the only thing that can survive. Only it has to work in a team. There is always a constant contest between tank and anti-tank technology, and what the tanks have to watch out for now is top attack systems. Like the Javelin, it attacks from the top. The UAVs are using top attack to destroy tanks. So tanks will have to be strengthened from the top. We may have to go in for heavier tanks with anti armor protection system, with APS, which surprisingly was not fielded by the Russians in this war. We don't really know the reasons why they did not test it out or field it, especially on their T-90 tanks. The Russians did not field their T-14 tanks, the Almaty tanks, their latest tanks, possibly because they are still not ready in large numbers, or they seem to be holding back because they still think that they may have to fight NATO. So they are holding their best formations in reserve. They have kept them out of the battle. That is also a very standard Russian practice. In the Second World War, they had a reserve army behind Moscow. You know, there was tremendous pressure as the Germans were advancing on Moscow, but General Field Marshal Zhukov, he never allowed that reserve to be used. It's only when the winter came and the Germans were in serious trouble that they attacked across with this reserve. So it's very strange, but despite their manpower shortages, the Russians have not deployed their reserves. The immediate reserves outside Ukraine, they are still in place, and they have not called up their reservists, or they have not called in for general mobilization. So they have still used the tank to very good effect, and now they have started getting the T-64, T-68, T-80 older generation tanks, and they are fielding them as assault guns, which is what is required. They have made very heavy use of artillery, and like Stalin said, artillery is the god of war. It is proving to be a war winning factor. And all this talk that sanctions have bitten home, it's also called equal problems in America, where oil prices have hit $5 a gallon, where inflation is rampant at a 40 years high. Food prices are going up, fertilizer prices are going up, base metal prices are going up. We have seeded chaos, and it is very short-sighted to have started this war. And now people seem to think that unless it becomes a global war or a nuclear war, Europe and America will not be satisfied. World War I started in Europe, World War II started in Europe, World War III also, it looks like at this rate, may start in Europe. UAVs, we were told at the time of the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, are war-winning factors now. They have destroyed tanks, they have destroyed artillery, nothing is required, all you need is UAVs. Sorry, wrong, incorrect. The simple fact is that UAVs cannot survive in a dense anti-aircraft environment. UAVs had serious problems in Yugoslavia, where 30 to 40% of them were shot down by heavy air defense environments. And in the Russian war, Russians in Syria had shown that they could beat back UAV attacks. And once again, they have shown that they are beating back UAV attacks. S-400, is it a game changer? Is it a war-winning factor? Well, it has proven to be an effective system. It has reduced Russian casualties due to enemy air attacks or UAV attacks. But it's not quite the war-winning factor that it was made out to be. The Russians relied upon its slant range, and they did not use their air force so much because they relied so heavily on the S-400. Lesson learnt is to use your air force. The Russians have not made optimal use of their air superiority. They allowed the Ukrainian air force to exist and to do sneak attacks almost till now, till the end. So I think reliance totally on the S-400 for anti-access, area denial, A2, AD is not the way to go forward. We have to use it in a judicious mix. We must use it for air defense, But when we are attacking across into the enemy territory, we cannot rely on the slant range of the S-400. We'll have to rely on our Air Force to ride shotgun to provide protection and to do heavy ground attacks. And we must increase the power of our medium artillery to pulverize, destruction shoots, not just neutralization or suppression shoots. There is another major lesson, that is communication security. The Russian communication security has been poor, it has been breached, and therefore the Americans were able to intercept communications and pass the locations of Russian generals, which the Ukrainians were able to ambush or kill or neutralize by artillery attacks or UAV attacks, etc. But a large number of Russian generals have died. Also because the Russian generals were leading from the front. All good generals do. All good generals do, and then you have to be prepared to take the casualties. There is another phenomena related, forward command from the rear. Sometimes the national leadership, generalist leadership, thinks it knows everything about everything. And then they try and micromanage the war. The job of the top leadership is to provide the grand strategic overviews, political directions. Then they must leave the war to the generals, those who are professionally trained. You can't start micromanaging from Moscow or Washington or New Delhi, the forward edge of the battle area, in the belief I am infallible, I can make no mistakes, I know everything about anything. I'm sorry, you may be a good politician, you may be a good intelligence chief, you may be a good bureaucrat, but that does not make you a good general. And therefore, don't try and micromanage the military. Don't have forward command from a command post in Moscow or New Delhi or Washington. If you want to control the battle on the ground, get there. You want to be Rommel, Guderian, Patton, well, they went to the spot themselves. They did not do it from their command post thousands of miles in the rear or hundreds of miles in the rears or whatever. So forward command from the rear is a dangerous tendency. It has been proven again. A lot of American propaganda to discredit Putin that he was micromanaging. Yes, to some extent he was. He was very keen on Kyiv, which proved to be wrong. And then he wanted the collateral damage, civilian damage to be reduced. It proved to be costly because the Russians are less in number. They had to use firepower to make up for their numbers, which are so less. The Ukrainians are 2.5 lakh, they are attacking with 1.5 lakhs, and that too they haven't used full. So then you have to use firepower, and then you can't go soft. You can't go soft. You have to fight by your tried and tested Russian way of war, which has proved to be successful in the south, in Crimea, in Mariupol, and now in Donbass. It is proving to be successful because if you lack manpower, you require heavy firepower. But you don't have heavy firepower, then you start reducing manpower, you are heading for a disaster. I want to point out that the answer is to increase our defense budgets. The American defense budget is $801 billion a year. Chinese is $293 billion a year. What is the Indian defense budget? $77 billion a year. What is Pakistan's budget? $11 billion a year. So to $293 billion of China, add $11 billion of Pakistan, and you want to reduce your defense budget? Have we taken leave of our senses? We have to increase our defense budget. We can't afford to reduce manpower. We don't have weapons. You may want to buy the weapons, all the weapons in the world. They aren't there now. And if you reduce manpower, in addition to a lack of weapons and technology, you are asking for a recipe for disaster. Let's please not go crazy over this manpower cutting, flab cutting nonsense. Bookkeepers can't become generals. They can't become field marshals. Let them stick to account keeping and bookkeeping. They can't be allowed to run amok with the armed forces. This is a major lesson learned from the Russian war. So, I'll just summarize the major lessons learned. Military demographics. Manpower is needed. Russia has all the weapons in the world, but it lacks manpower, and the ill effects are showing. We have no dearth of manpower, we are cutting manpower. 2 lakhs Indian Army strength has been cut during the COVID. Thank God we've started recruiting now. Der I durust hai, please don't cut manpower. Our problems, we have to fight in the mountains. Manpower, mountains eat up manpower. Counter-terrorist, counter-insurgency operations eat up manpower. You need more manpower. I mean, there's no getting away from it. This is theoretical moonshine, and it's only peacetime soldiers who have never been to the battlefields who talk of cutting manpower, because people who have had to fight like me, we are aware. एक casualty को उतारने के लिए, to get one man down from Kargil, from Siachen, from Ladakh, needs 18 men. So you can't cut flab. That flab looks flab in peacetime when there is no war on. In actual war, you will create a problem. This is what happened in Kargil. When we were trying to cut manpower, we had to restore it and we had to increase manpower. So don't cut manpower. Mediumization of the artillery was thought of in the Kargil war. It's still not been done. We need to accelerate. The lesson from the Russia-Ukraine war is the primacy of medium artillery, especially the 155 millimeter caliber. Let us standardize our artillery around this caliber. Let us do it fast. The Chinese and the Pakistanis will not wait for us to get ready before they create problems for us. The tank is not dead. UAVs are not a war-winning factor, nor are javelins, nor are Stinger missiles. They can increase the losses to the attacker, but they are not war-winning factors in themselves. So looking for magic wand solutions, new high-tech gizmos will not solve the war. The lessons of World War I and World War II have actually been repeated. Artillery has proved to be a war-winning factor in Ukraine. Ukrainian generals have been begging Americans not for javelins and stingers, but for 155 millimeter artillery and multi-barrel rocket launch systems, MBRLs. So let us learn from there. Forward defense versus rear defense. The Ukrainians had no natural obstacles. Unlike India and Pakistan, which have created canals and DCBs for defense, they decided to fight in their towns. Well, you can still be effective. You may beat back the enemy finally. But the fact of the matter is that it costs you heavy to have your towns and cities destroyed, infrastructure destroyed. You may have to fight forward. Try fight forward first before you start fighting in your cities and towns. So these are some of the lessons that we have learned from this war. Like I said, I would repeat in conclusion that this war is not theory. For India, 70 to 80% of our equipment is of Russian origin, and therefore we have to take a very close look at the war. Beyond post-truth, we have to get to the truth. Beyond propaganda, we have to get to reality and make sure that we draw the proper lessons, proper conclusions, and not get carried away by hype and propaganda and spin doctoring. A lot of our so-called armchair strategists are following into their trap and telling us the tank is dead, UAVs are the future and nothing. I'm sorry, UAVs haven't survived the heavy air defense environment which was there in Syria, which was there in Yugoslavia, which is there now in Ukraine. We have to think of conflict termination because the world is now suffering. The sanctions have had an equally bad effect on United States and Europe. As Russia has still gotten $60 billion for the past 4 months from Europeans who have been purchasing the Russian gas. So all this talk of sanctions, we have to look at it far more carefully. Those who have been imposing sanctions have suffered as much as those who are undergoing these sanctions. So the world is still to come to the conclusion of this conflict, and all the hype and propaganda may prove wrong. You can fool some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. That is what Abraham Lincoln had said a century ago. This still holds true.